perform a simple ceremony. The national anthem, the flag raising, were acts of deliberate provocation. The group had landed on South Georgia without permission or passports, and so, as they set about dismantling an old whaling station, Britain dispatched a detachment of Marines to force them to leave. Argentina claimed to be outraged at this national affront and decided to act. So began, from this remote, windswept and unlikely part of the world, events that led to Britain's biggest and bloodiest military operation since the Second World War.
Hands to dawn action stations, hands to dawn action stations. Assume MB City State 1, condition 0.
I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, and I counted them all back.
Target 01, command approved.
Call for fire, 01.
Engage.
Engaging.
In the course of its duties within the total exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands,
bring to resurrection with all the saints the bodies of these our brothers.
They've got us well and truly pinned down, but they're not trying to attack, so I think they're waiting for the armoured personnel vehicles to come. And then I think maybe they'll have another go.
The voice of the Governor of the Falklands, talking live from Government House on the island's radio as Argentine troops moved into Port Stanley. It was early in the morning of April the 2nd. Virtually the whole population was listening.
How much longer do you think you can hold out, sir?
Well, I mean, if they've got 30mm cannon on the armoured personnel carriers, so one or two shots at them and we'd be finished, I'm afraid.
Yes, sir.
But I'm hopeful that they'll send somebody in to talk.
And you'll talk to them, will you, sir?
I'll talk to them, but I'm not walking out. I'm not surrendering to the bloody arches, Patrick, certainly not.
But despite the Governor's defiant stance, within just a few hours of the landing, the Argentine flag was flying in the grounds of Government House. There had been a brief skirmish with the 64 British Marines defending the islands. One Argentine armoured personnel carrier was knocked out and several of their men killed. But outnumbered by more than 10 to 1, there was little the Marines could do.
Towards the end, when the armoured vehicles started to move in, we thought that was sort of the end of the show, and because we were surrounded by them, and we'd got no chance, like.
Most of the lads, realised that we were outnumbered so much that when the order came to give him, I think we were relieved a lot. There were so many of the APCs, and we were just surrounded by them all. Yeah, we were just relieved when it was all over.
They treated us very well. Very well. They were pretty civil to us. We just kept in the field until the rest of us had been rounded up. Once we'd been surrounded, the younger ones took over. They tried to sort of take some kid off us, just try and pitch it. The older ones who were a bit more experienced made them give it back to us.
When we actually got sent back to the airport, as we were driving past, we were sent back with the APC back to the airport, and you could see the civilians looking through the windows, they looked so worried. And you felt, if you'd let them down somewhere. But like I say, that's the reason why I wanted to go back, and I think that's what the reason why most of the folks want to go back.
As soon as news of the invasion reached Buenos Aires, the outburst of patriotism verged on hysteria. From childhood, every Argentine is taught that Islas Malvinas, as they call the Falklands, belong to them. Taking them over, and 2 days later, South Georgia, was a hugely popular move, guaranteed to keep people's minds off less palatable facts, like Argentina's massive inflation rate. or the widespread political repression. The man who had most to gain from the distractions of a successful Falklands invasion was the president, Leopoldo Galtieri. The president's power came from the army. He was also commander-in-chief. And as long as the army was winning, so was he. Supporting the president in the three-man ruling junta was Admiral Anaya, head of the Navy. The third and junior member was Brigadier Lamidoso, head of the Air Force. But in their search for ways of exploiting Argentina's strong sense of national pride, what these three men, and the people who advised them, misjudged so totally, was the reaction there would be to their Falkland adventure in Britain.
Prime Minister, BBC, can we have a word about the situation?
The House meets this Saturday to respond to a situation of great gravity. We are here because for the first time for many years, British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power. After several days of rising tension in our relations with Argentina, that country's armed forces attacked the Falkland Islands yesterday and established military control of the islands. The government has now decided that a large task force will sail as soon as all preparations are complete.
And that didn't take long. Enthusiasm for the idea of a task force was overwhelming, both from the public, as expressed in the opinion polls, and among the people involved directly. Everyone pitched in, ratings, pilots, medical teams, to get the ships away as fast as possible. The Defence Secretary, Mr. Knott, went down to Portsmouth to see for himself how the preparations were going. He'd been put very much on the spot by Argentina's action. In the House of Commons, he was accused of gross dereliction of duty for leaving the Falklands so defenceless. He'd offered the Prime Minister his resignation, but she persuaded him to stay on, and the responsibility for the turn of events was taken finally by the Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington.
There's no doubt about it that what happened in the Falkland Islands has been a great national humiliation. That some of us knew the difficulty of defending the Falkland Islands. You couldn't ever say so, of course, because it was an invitation to the Argentines to do it. The fact that some of us knew it, and nobody else did, has obviously made the shock for those who didn't very much greater. Now, I have been in charge of foreign policy, and as I say, the judgment was wrong about whether they were going to do it. Now, I don't think it's right in those circumstances that you behave as if nothing has happened and go on. And I thought that the honourable thing to do was resign, and I've done it.
April the 5th, the first ships from the task force were ready to leave. The size of the crowd lining Portsmouth Harbour to watch amazed everyone. Many thousands more than the relatives and friends one might have expected. Covering the story for BBC Television News that day, and as it happened for the next 10 dramatic weeks, was reporter Brian Hanrahan.
The fleet is moving with the government's warning that it's ready to use it in anger. I'll be sailing aboard HMS Hermes and sending back reports as and when naval secrecy allows. The departure astonished everybody. Men who'd been sweating in their working clothes to get the ships loaded rushed away to change into their best uniforms so they could stand on deck as Invincible led the way south. This was the big stick, we thought, and once it had been waved convincingly, we could all come back again. The only uncertainty in most minds was how far we'd need to go. Hermes, a tough old warrior, followed. But despite her age and craggy appearance, she had the best communications. She would be the flagship of the most powerful fleet Britain had ever put to sea. The crowds, the flags, genuine warmth came from the shore in waves. Few had ever seen the like before, and more than one came close to tears. The men in the task force had been too busy preparing for sea to think about what was happening, but it was as though those who stayed behind realized instinctively. The feeling of support back home was to remain a powerful source of comfort throughout the campaign.
I felt very sad, but also very, very proud, very British, and please God, they pulled it off.
Well, I think it gave me a thrill to think that we're still British. And here we are, and the full Navy is now in full force to give them some stick.
It's too much reeling in. 5 degrees either side should be plenty. This course 185 speed, 18 knots. 18. 184.
This was a war the Navy hadn't expected, hadn't prepared for, and hadn't planned. Much had to be improvised as they went along. Battle roundels were painted on the planes. Other white patches which attracted attention were covered over. But if the warm sunshine on deck suggested a casual atmosphere, the crowded hangar below showed ample evidence of serious intent. The maintenance technicians had to work out routines for looking after twice as many aircraft as were normally on board, and to keep them flying at all times. The task force sailed with only 20 Harriers to oppose an air force with 10 times as many planes. It couldn't afford to have any that were unserviceable. It was the same with the helicopters. They were nowhere near enough for the array of tasks laid upon them. They could hardly be spared for routine servicing. The maintenance men were the hidden heroes, only rarely glimpsing the outside world as they strained to give the pilots a proper chance to exercise their skills.
Right, domestics out of the way, £1,000 HEMC bomb checks. This is the meat of the sortie, so get this part right. First of all, checks when you get out to the airplane. Security, check that the old bomb is not about to fall off, rattle it. Then check on the bomb itself. Check the tail, must be secure, tightly fastened to the bomb. The spinner will be locked. Try the old vanes at the back, make sure they're not free to rotate, otherwise it could already be armed. And check that the tail isn't already opened. Okay, retard tail, don't forget 117. Fusing, 3 lanyards. 1 electrical for the Mark 951 fuse which we're using, the lanyard to the arming lock lever, and finally the lanyard to the retarder. And they're in that order, front to back. So check all 3, and then make the nose-tail fusing anyway, because it's good practice. Don't forget, if you can't get rid of it, on the usual pickle button, you can always hit the clear aircraft button, get rid of it that way, but it is on the centerline pylon, so if needs be, bring it back home. If something should go wrong and the bomb explodes, I can't help you, you're on your own. Okay, so just think about the sort of things that you might possibly get.
The Harrier is a remarkable plane, not least because when it takes off, it isn't really flying. It's still hovering, trying to build up flying speed, and not until it's several hundred feet clear of the carrier can the pilot finally swivel the jets round to point backwards for normal flight. The helicopters became the jack of all trades, moving men, stores, ammunition between the ships at sea, sorting out some of the muddle created in the haste of leaving port. The Sea King, in its anti-submarine role, has a radar hump on its back and a torpedo slung in its belly. At sea, the helicopter has changed the whole basis of communication. Each day there'd be a helicopter delivery service round every ship, dropping and picking up packages, making the fleet much more of a coherent force.
Hey, how is it? How's the mile out, Sky? Okay. Well, she probably radar silent. Alright, speed, sir. Well, do you want me to turn my helm up? What? Yeah. If you want me to use the radar, you're happy? No, I'm fine, happy. Yeah, got them into the door with a bag on. I think doing that speed, it's probably got wind. Oh, dear, they've got a helicopter on there. The wind is quite ahead by the looks of it. Easy and steady there. That's ridiculous. Good fight. Well forwarded properly.
The pilots of the blue helicopters, the ones in naval colours, are called pingers. That's because their first duty is to run an anti-submarine screen around the ships. Inside they have both radar and sonar equipment. The sonar sends back pings if it detects something below the surface. The problem then is deciding whether it's a whale or a shoal of fish or even a wreck. The pilots of the green ones are known as junglies. They carry the troops into battle, and they're specially trained to work with the commandos. They practiced their manoeuvres with a small detachment of Marines that sailed with Hermes ahead of the main landing force. The fleet plunged into radio silence almost at once, and lights and flags regained their importance. As the fleet was subject to regular Russian reconnaissance, turning off the radios at this stage probably had little practical effect, except as a practice for the manoeuvring that was to come. Broadsword, a frigate bigger than many destroyers, was assigned to protect the carriers, crisscrossing close and fast. She was armed with Seawolf, one of the world's most effective defensive missiles. But unfortunately, it only locks onto aircraft or missiles coming towards it. So Broadsword practiced placing herself between the carrier and any potential attacker. The way to land at sea, the pilots say, is to ignore your instruments, use your eyes, lock onto the deck and stay with it. It's a rather harder trick to pull off with the Harrier, but it's the same technique. The difference is that the Harrier drops the last 20 feet and once committed cannot pull back. Like many things military, it has its own momentum.
In Argentina, news that British troops were actually on the way came as something of a shock. Governments there hadn't fought anyone, except their own people, for more than 100 years. No one could really believe that a British government would go as far as using force to repossess the Falklands. The feeling was that it would all end, as usual, in talk. Most of the diplomatic wrangling at this stage was being done by the American Secretary of State, Mr. Haig, on his now famous peace shuttle. Mr. Haig's visit to Buenos Aires was part of an exhausting round of talks there, in London, in Washington and back, as he tried desperately to find the right formula.
Any success, Mr. Secretary? Any good news, Mr. Secretary?
We've been very busy and we've done a lot of work.
America's even-handed approach to the problem didn't go down too well in London, where the government wanted total US support. And in Buenos Aires too, Mr. Haig was left in no doubt where they wanted his sympathies to lie, even if the welcome they gave him seemed a little too well orchestrated. Mr. Haig had with him as a negotiating weapon UN Resolution 502, which called on Argentina to withdraw her forces. His problem was getting the junta to obey it, particularly in the country's present mood. As Mr. Haig's exhausting round of talks continued, Britain's preparation to back diplomacy with force was now well underway. Most of the fighting ships had left already. Now it was the turn of the men. the requisitioned luxury liner Canberra had disgorged her mink-coated clientele just 60 hours before.
Back up. Back up. Oh, yeah. Tell him there's no room to back up to. No room to back up to. Go forward. Come on, stop. We'll get there one day.
Answering questions at the time, the Ministry of Defence said Canberra wouldn't be sailing into a war zone. Few ships, as it turned out, have ever been closer.
Why? Too dirty for you? Too boring? Not enough melody? Well, don't speak French. Yeah, didn't understand the truth. And some unit representatives and some unit representatives report that their units and sub-units are correct and protocol forward.
Where's your kit? Who slugs this?
Departure was now only hours away, and once again the bands were out to give this very civilian ship a very military send-off. The role of the Great White Whale, as the Marines called her, in the war, and particularly in the landings at San Carlos, was crucial.
She's been continuously at sea for over 100 days. Nicholas Witchell reports on life aboard and looks at Stanley, now peaceful again.
A month after the fighting stopped, and Stanley lies peacefully in the soft winter sunshine. To the west of the town, Government House, home again of Rex Hunt. And on down the waterfront, Stanley Cathedral, where British troops knelt to remember their fallen comrades barely 6 weeks ago. Memories are already fading, but the sight of the neat little rows of houses, tided now, must bring them back. And there are many reminders close at hand. Stanley Harbour is crowded with task force ships. Some, the hospital ships, are still treating the injured. And on the far side of the bay, the blackened shell of the logistic landing ship Sir Tristram. HMS Endurance is here in the harbour, of course, her reprieve from the breaker's yard assured for many years to come. And out at sea, the other ship whose future with the Royal Navy was saved by the Falklands War. When we found HMS Invincible, she was on her 106th day at sea, already her longest, most arduous voyage ever, and still her Harrier patrols are flying. The fighters flew a staggering 600 combat missions from Invincible. According to ship's officers, her helicopters flew the equivalent of the distance from here to the moon. Their work continues. There are casualties still. Men injured doing routine tasks in seas which are frequently wild. All the planes are being kept fully armed with their missiles and cannon, just in case some further threat should materialize. Below decks, in the hangars and control rooms, the crew who've already kept Invincible at battle readiness for so many weeks must now face a further 2 months on South Atlantic patrol. Most of the other original task force ships have headed for home, but a carrier is still needed. So for Invincible, the slog goes on.
Well, I think it's just like being left at school when everyone else has gone home for the holidays. It's a rather depressing effect from many points of view. We were all worked up to cope with the war, and then the war suddenly isn't there, and so we have to change gear.
To take command of that transition, a new task force commander has arrived to take over from Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward. Rear Admiral Derek Reffel must find ways to motivate his force now that the fighting is over. It's a difficult task, but the military view is that great vigilance must be continued.
The governments have agreed a de facto cessation of hostilities, but I think there is some doubt as to whether the Argentinian control over their armed forces is complete with the present confusion in that country. And I have to be ready for any breach of the cessation of hostilities, whether it's government-sponsored in the Argentine or whether it is just some part of their forces which is not totally under control.
The town of Stanley is still a hazard. Half a dozen soldiers have been hurt by mines or booby traps, and hygiene is still a problem for both soldiers and civilians. No one yet...
Hands to dawn action stations. Hands to dawn action stations. Assume MB City State 1, condition 0.
I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, and I counted them all back.
Target 01, command approved.
Call for fire, 01. Engaging.
In the course of its duties within the total exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands,
Bring to resurrection with all the saints the bodies of these our brothers.
By the second week in April, the various elements in the huge task force the Prime Minister had ordered to the South Atlantic were now together, exercising daily to perfect their techniques. With one difference, the weapons they were dealing with were now primed for war. For Brian Hanrahan, in his role as war correspondent, life on board was becoming more than a story. It was beginning to be an experience.
It was time to start learning about the hardware of war. The Sidewinder missile, principal air combat weapon of the Harrier. The yellow band means a live warhead.
Just watch out for the fence.
Everyone learnt together. Technically, drill rounds and live rounds should be treated the same. But no matter what the book says, live weapons get more careful handling.
Okay, up together. Look, forward, and again.
Okay, it's all yours.
Right.
The buzzes on the soundtrack are produced by radar interference. Interference so powerful it turned our equipment on and off. There was always the risk that it might set off one of the weapons.
Okay.
All the way south, what used to be routine drill became steadily more realistic. On the flight deck, it's always action stations, full protective clothing, full accident precautions. High-performance aircraft leave no room for unnecessary risks.
Yeah, I've got 2 here, dress. Is that who's that there? Is that Joe Ladbrook? Get Ginge to come and check these fire lockers. Ginge, can you come and check these DC locker and fire locker?
For some, there was the sweating purgatory of hours in asbestos firefighting suits.
Don't put them on yet.
Section mates 31 closed up at 31.
Yeah, okay, mate.
The damage control center monitors the state of the ship and the speed of her reaction.
What's that, sir? Well, starboard maneuver alarm, it's okay, nothing there. Yeah, 2 papa starboard maneuver alarm.
State 1, action stations, everybody at their post. Condition Zulu, every hatch and doorway closed, everything movable lashed down.
State 1 yet? Section base 1 H1.
For any purposes.
Yeah, that's affirmative.
Do you want another headset? Section base 1. Another headset.
FLYCO, flight control, had the task of keeping the flight deck open 24 hours a day.
That's right, that's right. He had agreed.
Charlie 5 airborne.
Flight 2 minutes 55 for launch of 6. What's the score on the 3 on deck, their serviceability, these 3 Sea Harriers? They're all good. So you're telling me that I've got 9 up at the moment. 6 airborne and 3 on deck. Okay. That's good. And the so the problems of this morning have been rectified now, have they?
I'll cross to the aircraft that's on the...
Yeah, well, what about that undercarriage on the first launch?
Okay. That's good.
Dawn display of the Harrier's firepower. A demonstration as much for the men as for the Rear Admiral, Sandy Woodward, who just joined the ship. A 1,000-pound bomb, 2 on each Harrier. Rockets fired at a smoke target in the sea. Sidewinder, seeking the heat of a flare, just as it would the exhaust of an enemy fighter. And a cluster bomb which sprays shrapnel. How do you feel personally? I mean, no one for years has been put in a position like this. You've got a vast force, a lot of power. How do you feel about exercising it?
I don't know how much power I've got.
Well, firepower.
But I'm the executive. I've got a lot of firepower. Yes, okay, fine. I now know what you're talking about. Yes, I've got a lot of firepower, and if one is given the authority to use it, then I'll use it to the best advantage I can with the training I've had and with the assistance and skills I've got available to me. I'm not sure whether that's answering the question.
I was wondering if you'd feel sad at having to use it.
Oh, yes. I'm not a one for blowing people's heads off at the best of times, or at any time, if I can avoid it. I believe that the writings of the Chinese of a couple of thousand years ago, who said it's much better to win a war by not having it, which is one of those funny things that, you know, turn full circle, has to be right. If you can solve the differences and achieve the sensible answers without blowing people's heads off, that has to be good. And that must be me as a person, that must be how I feel. Equally, as a military man and as a loyal servant of the government, I hope. If my job is to start blowing heads off, I'll do it in the most efficient and effective way I have to.
Shot! Shot!
Gun and hoist empty, rounds complete.
The bridge of HMS Antelope tried out the 4.5-inch gun, computer-controlled accuracy.
Specs. Sisters, a 142.5 Cross Hill, a 168 Portland Point, Woodage a 183, Spear 161 NPL. Call for fire, 01. Engaging.
It was a time of considerable confidence, although senior officers were already saying that if force was used, there'd be ships sunk, men's lives lost. 6 weeks from now, Antelope would be sunk before our eyes in San Carlos water. But at that time, there seemed little point in fretting. We wouldn't decide our course. That would be charted for us by the politicians in London.
In Downing Street, the American Secretary of State, Mr. Haig, met the new Foreign Secretary, Mr. Pym, to see what he could do to reconcile the two sides. American sympathy lay with the British. The problem they had was how to support Mrs. Thatcher without offending their interests in Latin America. This even-handed approach didn't go down too well with the Prime Minister, despite the outward cordialities. Mr. Haig's negotiating position was to try to fudge the issue of sovereignty. But Mrs. Thatcher obviously wouldn't have that, and nor would the Argentine's principal negotiator, Dr. Costa Mendes, despite his confidence about a peaceful outcome.
As a diplomat, I'm confident that we will reach through negotiations, even if they are long negotiations, but we will reach peace and honorable and just peace through negotiations.
The military men on Hermes were less confident than the diplomatic Dr. Mendez. For their training, the Marines took over the quarterdeck, normally kept sacrosanct for the ship's officers.
Okay then, Miss Smith. When we get down there, it will be up to you to arm this weapon. For the purpose of this instruction, however, I will say prepare the weapon for firing. Remember to check your back blast area, take out the pin. Take out the pin. Take out the pin. Take the back blast area and extend the launcher tube. It's better not be on telly. Okay, stand by. 10 set imminent. Don't arm the weapon unless you're actually going to fire it. Okay, turn to your front, fire! Okay then, just relax and listen to me. In peacetime, remember, if it misfires again, release the weapon for 5 minutes on the shoulder. However, when we're down there, we're not going to stay in one position for 5 minutes. So get rid of it. Dispose of it to one side. Okay?
We obviously want to polish up our military skills, and though we've handled all these weapons fairly recently, there's no such thing as lack of practice on our part. The more practice we get in, the more proficient they're going to be when we get ashore. So we're really here this afternoon going through drills on the 66mm and the 84mm, both of which are anti-tank weapons or anti-armoured personnel carrier weapons. Very limited space. We haven't, in fact, got the sort of ranges that we'd like to practice over. So it's basic, simple drills of loading, unloading, using their sights, and getting familiar with handling that weapon.
Take action! Cock the weapon. Cock the weapon. It's not cocked. Pull it right out. Recock it. Come on, get it out. Pull it hard. It wasn't cocked, was it, Slider? Pull it out firmly. Hard. Right. Now cock it. Great. Anti-tank team. Soft-skin vehicle moving 200 metres. Right to left. Fire! Misfire. Knock it down again and close it back up for another practice.
Before I left Plymouth, I had men who'd been in my company 3 or 4 months before, had left for other jobs, queuing up outside company office, asking to come back. We had phone calls from our training establishment saying were there any vacancies for corporals or sergeants. Officers just finishing their training, phoning up the other commando, saying, is there a vacancy as a troop commander? My men are taking this absolutely 100% seriously.
The man with the white phosphorus burn might be your mate sitting next to you. What should you do?
If there are large lumps of phosphorus burning, it's either a jackknife or a bayonet. Rod it out. Dig in there. Get the big lumps out. Little lumps, leave them. Once you've done that, soak a shell dressing, put it on, bind it on, and keep it wet. So, to summarise then, the grenades we're going to be carrying. L2 grenade, ideal for house clearing.
We're actually talking about 3 commando units, plus the 3rd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment. That's 4 combat battalions to land. That's still quite a sizable force. We're talking about 2,000 bayonets there, let alone our artillery, our engineers, our logistics support, our air support. It goes on and on.
You don't sound as if you lack confidence.
None at all. None at all.
Stand by with a belt of 50 rounds. Load up. Ready. Pick a point. Out to sea. Stand by. Fire! £2. Any advance on you? £3 for ticket. £3 over there. Any more? Any advance?
Easter Sunday saw a group of us waiting apprehensively to have our beard shaved off. We'd been told that they'd all have to go, so gas masks could make an airtight seal against the skin. And the chief petty officers, the force behind much that went on aboard, hatched up a scheme to sell them for charity. The profits were considerably swollen by ITN, whose reporter, Mike Nicholson, was willing to pay a high price for the first go at mine.
Here we go, Jack. I think this is professional rivalry a bit far, don't you? Hang on. They're blunt. I'm not.
£15 the first. This is where ITV gets his own back on.
Oh,
here we go.
You done this before?
There we go. Thank you very much. Okay, then. Now, if we can all move back a bit so we can have a nice single file of people coming in, handing over their money for a step on their favourite house.
Always going deep, Vince.
There's a fried egg in there.
Hey, that's a quick one.
Hey, look, it's Wainsworth.
Oh, no.
I'm the ugliest.
The rest went, snip by snip, 10 pence a time.
Keep the queue going. Come on, let's have some more of it. Let's have some more.
And at the end of the afternoon, a children's home near Devonport was £50 better off.
Can you move back a bit, chap? Joe Colours haven't go with those big scissors.
Skin underneath.
Leave his chin. Don't pull it. Leave his chin. Come on.
A few weeks later, the ship's commander told us it had all been unnecessary. There was no gas threat, no need for gas masks, and no need for shaving.
All the money goes to charity.
He's promised a drink to everyone back in port.
Come on, there's no job we haven't had a go yet.
Have we got the surgeon standing by?
Leave his hair on.
Hermes has its own operating theatre, with a fully qualified surgeon and an anaesthetist permanently on board.
The surgeon's getting ready. The patient's been kept asleep. He's been put to sleep with some intravenous drugs. He's also fully relaxed with a muscle relaxer so that the surgeon can get through the muscle layers without any trouble.
This was a routine operation for an appendix.
It's the diathermy machine. I use this for cauterising blood vessels when they bleed. What's the diathermy chief for?
4, sir.
Same as the name, isn't it? We use one knife for opening the skin, and we use the second knife for going down to the deeper layers. Clean everything up. We're down to the muscles now.
Two straight clips.
Close there, aren't we? Yeah. Right, here's the appendix. Notice how it stopped bleeding suddenly. There's a famous last word. So we slice off the appendix like that. All these sutures are welded onto the needle, so they're what they call atraumatic sutures. So now I'm sewing up that little layer of skin that lines the abdomen, and we're just going to have, what we do is come back out the way we went in. Cut one.
With a mixture of medical and maritime humour, they swapped stories that took more than a little believing.
And they loaded the patient on 2 operating tables. He's about 35 stones. And you really wonder what the hell he let himself in for. That's the consolidation. That's right. Transversal rather. You really wonder what he let himself in for. So he knew approximately where he got to make the hole. So he started making this hole, and he cut down and down and down and down through fat and more fat and more fat. So he's up to his elbows in fat. And then he saw this white shiny layer. I thought, thank God for that, I've reached the abdomen at last. And he got a knife and went straight through it and came out on the table the other side. He'd gone straight past and missed it altogether. Cost him a lot of money at the Medical Defence Union then. So the most important thing to ever do in any operation is to make sure the scar you leave on the skin is perfect.
Well, I think he'd be very proud of that, wouldn't he?
There we are. 150 guinea wound.
Just take nice deep breaths in and out.
Nice deep breath. Come on, nice deep breath. That's a good lad. Mark, open your eyes.
Alright. All over, Mark.
Sorry, down a bit.
Wrong way, Mark.
Sorry.
After a short convalescence in the sick bay, the patient was returned to duty as soon as he was fit. The carrier is a self-contained world, which tries to maintain as normal and full a life as possible. Roger Devonshire, known to everyone as the Rev Dev, doubles as the newsreader on the ship's television.
Good morning and welcome to this service. I'm very pleased that amidst all the other things that are going on this morning, we have managed to find these few moments to come together and worship God on Easter Day. Because Easter is about victory. Not the victory of one country over another, but something far deeper and far more personal. For there is another victory which we, each one of us, are working towards in our different ways and in this ship. It has nothing to do with the Falkland Islands, except that the crisis is what has brought us here. It does have everything to do with these days, perhaps weeks, perhaps months, which we spend together in the ship.
Who's winning? Who's winning? Who's that? Too many in my life. One is on the Albion and the other's on the fight. Just get on with your work. Come on. Not with that. What do you want? Weird? Hang on. Don't cut the routine. Those that weird. Going over to unit.
You got 5 minutes. I'll screw you out of 5, okay? I'll screw you out of 10. 10. There you go. 75 feet. New ball, referee. Oh, he's doing well. He's tiring. Oh, he's tiring. Come on. Change the ball! Change the ball! Come on!
Could you explain where you won these impressive service medals?
Yellow for cowardice. Won them. I haven't got as many as
a raffle, boy.
That was cowardice, and that was at the roulette table. Oh, you got the same one as well.
Yeah, well, that's the Sick Bay Rangers medal. You've got a Sick Bay Rangers medal. You see 500 Sick Bay Rangers, you get a medal. We see 500 a day.
That's right. That was
what are you guys standing around here for? Get up there and hit on, boy!
I just want to say that Yankee Pete's got no chance. We won't be blowing them.
Sorry about this.
We have got the warships, we have got the women, sorry, the men, and we will wipe the floor with these Yanks. The British, we don't like. They're very good. We don't like these Yanks.
Underway for the next race.
What is your purpose in being on this ship? I mean,
it's quite simple. I'm a spy.
You are a spy.
See.
Are you good at your business?
Well, I'm in disguise now. There's no chance they will take me, you know.
Can you give us any indication what the Argentinian battle plan is?
See, when the English get very close, we are going to f*** off.
Is that called a tactical retreat?
I see, it's called cowardice as well, where I come from.
AM Francis Lance, Corporal Franklin, LAM Fuller, AEA
Crossing the equator provided a few more hours of knockabout humour. Those of us who'd not crossed the line before, and a few who had, got seized and dunked. But first, we were liberally smeared with flour and water paste. People were pulled in from all over the ship to pay homage to King Neptune.
Keep your mouth shut! Kiss the blind hand! Take him away! Ah! Impersonate the frog! Don't go on with the guns! Take him to the judge!
No escape was allowed. And trying was foolhardy.
Take this one over! Beat him up, then! No, beat him! Take him to the judge! Out, dog! Take him to the physician!
The concoction they tried to make everyone drink had the foulest taste imaginable. It was all intended to make you remember. On a voyage, no one was likely to forget.
On the Falkland Islands themselves, now getting closer by the day, the Argentines were pouring in more and more troops. By the middle of April, it was becoming plain that they'd have to be dislodged by something more than negotiation.
This ship carried proudly the Red Ensign as one of the many merchant ships to back up the Navy task force. The 15,000-ton Atlantic Causeway and her sister ship, Atlantic Conveyor, were the secret weapons of the British re-invasion, container carriers that were converted in Devonport Dockyard to aircraft carriers.
Sadly, Atlantic Causeway will be the only Cunard container ship to return. Atlantic Conveyor was hit by an Exocet and, despite her massive size, could not survive the attack. But for Causeway, that was all behind her. In just 6.5 days, she was converted in Devonport Dockyard from a container carrier on the North Atlantic run to a floating landing pad for 20 Wessex and 8 Sea King helicopters. And she carried vital stores, 250 tons of aviation fuel, a Rapier missile battery, and compo rations for the men ashore. And Causeway didn't come back empty-handed. On her deck, the spoils of war, 2 Pucaras of the Argentine Air Force. Found abandoned, but in almost mint condition on Port Stanley Airfield, the 2 ground attack aircraft are destined for Air Force and Fleet Air Arm museums. On display, the punch they pack, cannon, machine guns and rocket launchers.
32 years in the Navy, all the time with aircraft carriers.
Atlantic Causeway, which brought 2 of them back from the South Atlantic. The giant Chinook helicopter from RAF Odium near Basingstoke was more than a match for the Pucara, which weighs 9,000 pounds. Their destination was the Royal Naval Air Station at Yeovilton, where the Pucara will form part of an exhibition about the Falklands conflict. It's also hoped to fly it at the station's Air Day.
Action stations, harvest the dawn action stations. Assume MB City, state 1, condition 0.
I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, and I counted them all back.
Target 01, command approved.
Call for fire, 01. Engaging.
In the course of its duties, within the total exclusion zone, around the Falkland Islands.
Take it in!
resurrection with all the saints, the bodies of these our brothers.
By the end of the first fortnight in April, Argentina's hold on the Falklands was complete. A massive airlift had brought in more than 9,000 troops and vast quantities of supplies. Planes flew the 800-mile round trip to the mainland every day, building up the garrison with more and more men and material. In a move to stop the constant flow of reinforcements, Britain announced a total exclusion zone around the islands. In effect, a blockade. Any Argentine ship, and later it applied to planes too, entering an area within 200 miles of the Falklands was likely to be attacked. For the Argentines, it meant that restocking their supplies became a hazardous business, though they did manage to get some things through right to the end. The commander of the Argentine troops on the island, also appointed governor, was 52-year-old General Mario Menendez. He had a reputation as a hard-liner, and despite his outward charm, he was a tough soldier who'd made his name fighting rural guerrillas in the remote Argentine outback. Winning the hearts and minds of the local people was one of the general's main preoccupations. That, and also doing his bit to reassure world opinion.
How many troops are in the island?
Well, I can say you that we have here many troops, but not exactly the number. I think this is a special thing for military matters. Do you understand?
Can you tell us how se puede decir cómo anda su cooperación con el pueblo aquí malvinense? How are you getting along with the people here?
I think it's a particular thing because the people of the islands is now, I think, a little afraid in order it will be military operation here.
With all the equipment the Argentines had moved in, the prospect of a military operation was obviously very much on the cards. The army was looking more and more like an occupation force. Most of the men were conscripts who joined at 18, often reluctantly, to serve the 12 months minimum. For the regulars, though, the Falklands campaign was a rare opportunity to put their military talents to use. Argentina hadn't fought a foreign power for more than a century. These soldiers, interviewed by an American television crew, had just arrived in Port Stanley.
We are very well, and we think that we are in the right here, so we came to stay here because the islands are from us.
Do you think that the British will ever be able to take these islands back?
No, I don't think so. I think that the islands must remain for Argentina, and they will remain for Argentina.
The Argentine authorities had issued the islanders with a long list of do's and don'ts. They were to drive on the right-hand side of the road. No one was to travel without military approval. Identity cards were issued. Food supplies were all right, although shops were only allowed to open for 2 hours in the morning. Even then, there weren't many customers. Most Port Stanley people had left for the country, or camp as they call it, leaving just a few families behind. The Argentine authorities also made a start at trying to get the islanders to learn Spanish. To avoid it, as a gesture, they refused to send their children to school.
Okay, which is the school? This one here. That's the senior school. The junior school is probably looks a bit more school-like.
Where the soldier is right there is the main entrance to the school?
That's the main entrance to the senior school.
And why did you decide to walk out?
We walked out because we could not hold school in the conditions that prevailed immediately after the invasion. We had military presence, especially outside the junior school, the infant school. We had tanks, we had soldiers in the yard. And most of our school population were disappearing to the camp anyway, to the countryside.
Did they put restrictions on what you could teach?
No, they said that they wouldn't, but at the same time we didn't wish to be seen to be supporting their regime in any way. In fact, we have been holding school for the younger children in private houses, but we weren't going to give them that propaganda of supporting their idea of normalcy. This place has been raped, so there's no way that there is a normal situation.
Too much. So they said they wouldn't change it. They're already doing that. They're changing things so much.
Like what?
Well, they're putting all our expatriates out of their jobs. I mean, we can't talk the language. They have a different way of living anyway. I mean, they're going up and down here with guns, and I've even seen them in the hospital with guns. We don't like that sort of thing.
We were supposed to carry on as normal, right? These arrows show suddenly you've got to change the way you run your traffic. How can you carry on as normal? It's ridiculous. The people here don't want Argentine rule. You probably won't get many of them say it because they're scared.
I'm staying. I'm staying if it remains the Falklands, but not Argentina. I can't say anymore. It makes me so angry. The old people are frightened. They're frightened. Some of them are frightened to go out of their homes. They've been begging for food at the doors. And now I'm going to see if I can see Blue Marie, this is the chap in charge, to see if I can get something done about this old man's property. They're checking houses now to see who's left in them, who's not left in them. You know, for Christ's sake, somebody out there, do something. Something, anything.
But something was beginning to happen. Across the ocean, Ascension Island was being converted into the advanced British base from which the invasion would be launched. The task force had split in two. While the warships headed south to enforce the British blockade, the troop ships waited until they were needed. Stores from Britain were decanted through the American airbase.
Yeah, but just bring the stuff in and we'll get the working party today.
It was a chance to redistribute the units and their equipment to allow for the most efficient disembarkation when the moment for invasion arrived. It also gave the troops a chance to train and relax and become less jaded with shipboard life. Time too to think of wives back home and send some video snapshots of life on board, with one of the colonels providing an introduction into this inside view of army life.
What we're going to do now is to show you what life, daily life on board is like and some of the things we're doing. You'll see some fitness training, some other forms of routine training, and some domestic shots as well of life below decks, and that'll give you a good impression of the general life on board.
We don't want any of the wives to hear bad language, because they'll think that we're ever such an uncouth bunch.
The Colonel also provided a commentary to go with the tape.
This is all the married men we could muster in Charlie Company cleaning their weapons after a period of weapon training. He's bashful. I think you'll agree that all of us look pretty cheerful, in spite of the fact that we're away from all you girls at home. The inevitable queue, I'm afraid, for lunch. Today, silver-sided beef. The girls will be pleased to hear that the boys have cut down their intake of potatoes on board. Too much food doesn't help the fitness. No bread on board here, it's all rolls. And this is the officers and seniors dining room. Where we have the privilege of being served by the P&O stewards, one of whom you see here, complete with earring. We're all firmly of the belief that any future LPH or commando ship should be built on the lines of Canberra. We hear stories that people in the other ships are living in conditions below decks of something like 120 degrees. We're certainly not. And as a result, our morale is much higher and our fitness greater.
It's difficult, I know, for you not to worry about us, but I can assure you there is no need to at all. We are well able to look after ourselves, and the newspapers generally tend to exaggerate and dramatize. Listen to the news, both on the radio and television. That will give you a very accurate picture of what is happening. But don't believe half of what you read in the newspapers.
But when it came to misleading the public, Argentina was in a class of her own. Leading politicians made frequent and emotional television appearances. Much was made of the sacrifice some people were making to support the men on the islands. Television auctions were a regular feature. As television audiences were bombarded with appeals, millions of pesos poured into the studios night after night. These huge television patriotic spectaculars, appealing to pretty fundamental nationalistic instincts, were also designed to get the message across to an international audience, because these programs weren't just designed for internal consumption. Britain, on the other hand, had its own way of dealing with the media.
This press briefing is to give you a factual military briefing of the events yesterday, leading to the...
Mr. Ian MacDonald, as the Ministry of Defence spokesman, became something of a national figure through his Whitehall press conferences. But away from the MOD, there was much criticism of the lack of detail and pictures from the front. A good example was the recapture of South Georgia. The Argentine Marines who'd taken over the islands at the same time as the Falklands invasion were pictured on television as part of coverage designed to portray the action as a military triumph. Pictures showing how the British recaptured South Georgia were virtually non-existent, despite the fact that the operation was a copybook exercise with minimum casualties. A small flotilla of ships was detached from the task force as a base for the action. Then, on April the 25th, a helicopter spotted an Argentine submarine just outside Grytviken Bay. It attacked, and though the damage wasn't great, the submarine, the Santa Fe, was beached in the bay, the captain surrendered, and 156 prisoners were taken. The Ministry of Defense lost a good propaganda opportunity by not having professional cameras to cover the surrender ceremony. The only pictures of this historic event were taken by a sailor with an 8mm camera. Propaganda apart, though, the recapture of South Georgia was a great morale booster.
The commander of the operation has sent the following message. Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the White Ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen.
What happens next, Mr. Knott?
Thank you very much.
Just rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines.
Are we going
Good
to
night,
declare war on
gentlemen.
Argentina, Mrs. Thatcher?
Rejoice.
In Buenos Aires, the news from South Georgia was received a little differently. Morale in Buenos Aires slumped even lower when, towards the end of April, it became plain that America was now coming out firmly on Britain's side. President Reagan explained why he was putting pressure on the junta.
We must remember that the aggression was on the part of Argentina in this dispute over the sovereignty of that little ice-cold bunch of land down there, and they finally just resorted to armed aggression, and there was bloodshed. And I think the principle that all of us must abide by is armed aggression of that kind must not be allowed to succeed.
By now, the main task force was about to enter the exclusion zone, and the Harrier pilots were being briefed for the first airstrike.
Ted, the depression for CBU is worked out for what, 480 knots? 480 flap out, 450, sorry, yeah, 480 flap out, 450 mid flap. Okay?
It was to be an attack coordinated with a Vulcan bomber flying 3,500 miles from Ascension Island. The Harriers would follow it in after daybreak, and with the defences alert, they were told that 3 of them could expect to be shot down. Each aircraft would take 3 bombs. Others would be armed with Sidewinder missiles and Flyer's fighter escort. The Harrier can function as either a fighter or a bomber. The same pods under the wing can carry bombs or missiles. The bomb mix included high explosives for cratering the runway, some with delayed action fuses, and cluster bombs, known as CBUs, to hurl shrapnel at planes, radars, and people. By dawn, the fleet's radar had tracked the Vulcan, codenamed Black Buck, across Stanley Airfield, and monitored the code word that its bombs had been dropped. It was time for the Harriers to join the offensive to recapture the Falklands.
Clear on Sea Harrier 23, after it, flying to ATQ run. Fine super close up Sea Harrier 23.
Every plane in the task force joined the raid, 12 from Hermes, 8 more from Invincible, 20 in all. They wheeled around the sky, forming up before heading 90 miles west towards the islands.
8:23 de la mañana se repite el ataque contra Puerto Argentino con mucha mayor intensidad. Antes habían sido 2 aviones que habían bombardeado el aeropuerto con escasa suerte. Ahora el tiroteo es mucho más intenso y se ve que además otro de los blancos es el mercante argentino que está...
From Port Stanley across the bay, an Argentine camera team watched the bombs falling and the fierce anti-aircraft fire.
Contestan nuestras baterías antiaéreas y se ve el refulgir de sus disparos en el aire.
The Harriers came in low around the mountains to strike at the headland on which the airfield was
Un
built.
ruido que ahora se hace más intenso. Parecen fuegos de artificio. Más allá se ve una humareda que se levanta en el lugar donde aproximadamente se encuentra el aeropuerto. Estaría en llamas en este momento. Ahí se ve el avión atacante. Pasa, se pierde hacia la derecha. Otro avión más. Siguen las explosiones en el aeropuerto que podrían ser originadas, además de las bombas, por los combustibles que explotan. Misiles nuestros se dirigen en busca del avión enemigo.
Me están tirando ahí al buque. Me están tirando al buque, Fernando.
Argentine Mirage fighters from the mainland arrived too late to intercept the Harriers.
Aquí vemos que se responde a los disparos que efectúan los aviones ingleses. Se está atacando en estos momentos la bahía, como así también la zona del aeropuerto.
War hadn't been declared, but that made it no less real. The main raid was on Stanley, but 3 planes also went to Goose Green, which was thought to be the main base for the Pucara ground attack aircraft. No match for the Harrier, but dangerous against ground troops. Out at sea, it was a tense 40 minutes before the planes returned, with everybody watching, counting, wondering if they'd all make it back safely. they did. Only one plane was hit, the pilot unhurt. The damage, a hole in the tail.
It's all right. It's only a little hole on the other side, don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's it.
Good to see you back, Alan.
And 20 mil.
I didn't see it
20
this
mil.
side. I didn't see it at all. No, it's not hole there. I didn't fucking go at all. What I mean? Here, I think. Didn't give the old 5-bar gate lead, that's what it was.
They'd had their first test under fire.
For about 2 seconds it scared me farthest, and then after that we just had to concentrate on the job in hand, because we all knew what we had to do, we knew which routes we were taking, and it was just a question of getting as low as you could, weaving around what flank you could, and putting your weapons on the target.
What were you putting down and where?
I took 3 CBUs, and my brief was to run in from the northern end of the airfield, across the runway, and spread them across the runway into the domestic side, into the aircraft pan.
In the briefing room, there was hardly time to take stock of the raid before getting airborne again. The Harriers had to be back providing air cover for the ships immediately. Argentine aircraft probed the defences continually throughout the rest of the day. 2 of them were shot down. Several British ships were bombed, though without sustaining serious damage. Reconnaissance photos of the airfield showed that the Vulcan had laid a trail of bombs and got 1 on the runway. Other low-level pictures of the raid showed the effect of the Harrier bombs. But was it enough to close the runway and enforce the air blockade? Pictures flown out to Argentina were evidence that it was not. There was substantial damage, but enough of the runway was intact for transport planes to keep on flying. For the Argentine troops, the raid marked the start of a near constant British bombardment from the Royal Navy's 4.5-inch guns. Starting that day, and almost every night afterwards, the Navy shelled their positions, trying to close the runway and cause discomfort and disarray.
For the Argentine troops, that constant naval bombardment was only the beginning.
Dawn action stations. Harness to Dawn action stations. Assume MB City State 1, condition 0.
I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, and I counted them all back.
Target 01, command approved.
Call for fire, 01. Engaging.
In the course of its duties,
within the total exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands.
Into resurrection with all the saints, the bodies of these our brothers.
At the beginning of May, while the diplomats and politicians searched for a peaceful solution to the Falklands crisis, ships from the huge task force the government had sent to the South Atlantic were on station, policing the 200-mile exclusion zone around the islands. Any Argentine ship or plane entering the area was deemed a legitimate target. So far, most of the military activity had been confined to aerial attacks and naval bombardments on Argentine positions round the Port Stanley airstrip. But on the night of May the 2nd, an action took place that fundamentally changed the course of the conflict, put it on quite a different level. The British nuclear-powered submarine Conqueror normally patrols the waters of the North Atlantic on routine NATO business. The nearest she gets to action stations is on the various exercises against other friendly ships pretending to be the enemy.
Just right ahead on that bearing. 355-ish. No. I'll sonar to identify each target if we can.
Conqueror is a hunter-killer submarine armed with the latest Tigerfish torpedo. Since the start of the Falklands crisis, she'd been in the South Atlantic shadowing the movement of the Argentine fleet. In her sights now was Argentina's second-largest ship, the cruiser General Belgrano. The ship was 59 miles outside the exclusion zone. One of Conqueror's torpedoes hit her amidships, and in less than an hour, she'd sunk. As the 1,000-strong crew took to the lifeboats, the two escorting destroyers fled. 382 men were lost. In Buenos Aires, reaction to the sinking of the Belgrano was stunned disbelief, and a final realization that Britain really did mean business. To placate international concern, the Foreign Secretary